Some people walk through life with a weight no one can see, a quiet heaviness that settles in their chest like an old winter. You notice it in their eyes first. They carry a depth that doesn't match their age, a stillness that feels learned rather than lived. It isn't wisdom, it's survival. It's the kind of maturity that forms when someone grows up in rooms where emotions were unstable, where silence felt safer than asking for help, where they learned to observe everything because not observing could mean getting hurt. These are the people who feel older than they are, not because time shaped them, but because life did. And this documentary gently unravels the quiet trauma behind it. There is a moment, often small and unremarkable, when a person first realizes they feel older than their age. It doesn't come as a dramatic revelation. It arrives quietly, like noticing that everyone around them is laughing a little louder, worrying a little less, moving through life with an ease that feels distant and unfamiliar. They watch people their age stumble, experiment, make reckless choices, and feel surprised, not at the choices, but at how foreign that freedom feels to them. It is in these moments that an inner truth begins to surface. They never had the luxury of being their age. It often begins in childhood, long before they understand what it means to grow up. They remember being the child who could sense tension in a room before anyone said a word, the one who sat silently on the edge of conversations, noticing the rise and fall of voices, the expressions adults tried to hide, the tremble of something unsafe underneath. Other children were busy being children, running, shouting, crying freely, while they were learning how to adjust themselves to keep peace alive. They learned early that being too loud, too emotional, or too needy could make the world around them unstable. Recognition doesn't come through memories alone. Sometimes it arrives through contrast. They spend time with someone who grew up differently, someone carefree, someone who hasn't learned to scan for danger with their eyes before they speak. And suddenly they notice the difference. They notice how their own shoulders stay slightly tense, how their thoughts always run one step ahead, predicting what might go wrong, how they say, "It's okay," even when it isn't, because discomfort feels familiar while vulnerability feels impossible. The gap between who they are and who they might have been quietly widens. There is also a certain loneliness in this awareness. People often praise them for their maturity, their emotional intelligence, their ability to handle difficult situations. They hear things like, "You're so wise for your age," or "You're incredibly composed," and they smile politely. They accept the words because they've learned that their strengths are easier for others to understand than their wounds. But inside, there is an ache, a subtle wish that their maturity hadn't been earned through pain, a wish that they could remember a time when life felt light, when responsibility didn't pull them upward faster than their childhood could keep up. And yet, the recognition is not bitter. It is quiet, layered, complex. They begin to understand that their older feeling isn't a personality trait. It's an emotional history. It's the accumulation of years spent comforting themselves in moments when no one else could. It's the weight of secrets they held to protect others. The stability they created in homes where stability was fragile. The resilience they built long before they ever chose it. Sometimes, the recognition shows itself through exhaustion, not the kind cured by sleep, but the kind that grows from decades of being alert. Even when they are young, their mind feels weathered, as if it has traveled farther than their body has lived. They may find it difficult to relax, difficult to trust joy, difficult to believe that life can be soft. Not because they are pessimistic, but because joy is a language they were never taught fluently. It takes time to understand it. And yet in that quiet recognition, there is also a strange form of clarity. They understand themselves a little more. They see their patterns not as flaws, but as adaptations. They see their tiredness not as weakness, but as evidence of a childhood spent carrying emotional weight too heavy for small hands. They realize that feeling older than their age is not a mystery. It is the echo of everything they survived. This chapter marks the beginning of that awareness, the soft discovery that the soul can age before the body does, and that some people grow up not because they want to, but because life leaves them no other choice. The story of feeling older than your age always begins long before you realize it. It begins in childhood, in moments that seemed ordinary at the time, but quietly shaped the entire architecture of your emotional world. Forced maturity does not appear suddenly. It grows slowly, like a tree bending toward survival, adjusting itself to whatever light or darkness it grows beneath. For many, it starts in households where emotions were unpredictable, where the mood of one adult controlled the weather of the home. Children in these environments learn to read micro-expressions the way others read storybooks. A sigh meant frustration. A slammed door meant danger. A long silence meant they should stay small and invisible. They weren't taught these things. They absorbed them. Because children do not analyze their surroundings, they adapt to them. Some grew up being the responsible one, not because they wanted responsibility, but because someone in the family needed to hold everything together, even if they were too young to understand what they were holding. They became the peacemaker during arguments, the quiet listener to a parent who overshared, the emotional support system for adults who never learned to regulate their own feelings. And while other children were playing outside, they were learning how to soothe an adult's emotional storm. Others grew up in emotionally absent homes, homes where love wasn't loud, but instead existed in small, inconsistent gestures that felt fragile. Children raised in these environments learn to take care of themselves early, making their own meals, soothing their own fears, carrying their own heartbreaks without expecting comfort. Even without chaos, the absence of emotional presence creates its own kind of aging. A child who learns not to ask for help grows into an adult who feels older than everyone around them because they had to become their own parent. And then there are those who were praised for being mature, the quiet one, the organized one, the child who never caused trouble. Adults clapped for them, complimented them, believing their maturity was natural, admirable, or a sign of strong upbringing. No one wondered why the child didn't cry, why they never asked for attention, why they acted like a small adult instead of a carefree kid. No one thought to ask if the child was performing stability because instability frightened them. Some children are forced into maturity through trauma, a sudden loss, a violent home, a betrayal, an illness. When something shatters their sense of safety, they learn, instantly and permanently, that life can change without warning. And from that moment forward, the world stops being a playground. It becomes something they must navigate carefully. Even as adults, they carry that early shock in their nervous system, like a shadow that never fully leaves. At the core of forced maturity lies one unspoken truth. The child had to adapt to emotions, responsibilities, or dangers that their brain was never meant to handle so early. Children are wired for exploration, curiosity, and expression. But when the environment demands caution, vigilance, or emotional labor, the brain shifts. It prioritizes survival over play, awareness over comfort, self-regulation over innocence. The child grows older inside, quietly, invisibly, inevitably. These roots grow deep. They influence how someone loves, trusts, reacts, and even rests. A person who learned early that they must take care of others struggles to let others take care of them as adults. A person who grew up reading danger in every silence struggles to believe that silence can be peaceful. A person who learned to stay strong for everyone else often forgets that strength was never meant to be their only identity. And so the child becomes an adult who feels older than the years they've lived, not because they have lived longer, but because they have lived faster. Their emotional clock runs on a different rhythm, measured not by birthdays, but by the weight of everything they carried before they even knew what carrying was. There is a quiet science behind why some people feel older than their age, not the poetic kind, the biological kind. The nervous system remembers things the mind tries to forget, and the body grows around experiences it had no choice but to survive. Forced maturity is emotional, yes, but it is also chemical, neurological, and deeply physical. When a child grows up in an environment where unpredictability is the norm, their brain begins to reorganize itself around vigilance. Neuroscientists often describe the developing brain as experience dependent. It learns from whatever pattern it is exposed to most. So if a child grows up around safety, their brain wires for exploration, creativity, and trust. But if a child grows up around stress, loud arguments, emotional instability, sudden shifts in mood, or silent tension, their brain wires for survival. One of the first systems affected is the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for detecting danger. In a stressful home, the amygdala becomes hyperactive. It scans constantly. It reacts quickly. It learns to predict threat even when none exists. As adults, these individuals often describe themselves as too aware, too cautious, or too sensitive. But beneath those words lies a scientific truth. Their brain was trained to stay alert long before it was fully formed. Next is the prefrontal cortex, the center of reasoning, self-control, emotional regulation. In stable homes, this part of the brain strengthens slowly over time. But when a child repeatedly suppresses emotions to keep the peace, or regulates themselves because no one is regulating them, this region matures fast, not in a healthy, balanced way, but in a way that mirrors adulthood before adulthood arrives. This is why some people seem older, calmer, or more composed than their peers. It's not natural maturity, it's neurological adaptation. The stress hormone cortisol also plays its role. A child who experiences prolonged emotional stress develops a body that stays in a subtle state of tension. Their muscles tighten easily. Their stomach reacts to anxiety. Their heart rate rises the moment something feels uncertain. Even decades later, their body behaves as if danger could return at any moment. This leads to a kind of emotional aging, a weariness that feels too heavy for the number of years lived. Then there is attachment, the internal blueprint that forms our understanding of safety in relationships. Children who grow up emotionally neglected learn to comfort themselves early. Children who grow up emotionally overwhelmed learn to suppress their needs early. Children who grow up around inconsistency develop a nervous system that swings between craving closeness and fearing it. These patterns shape how someone moves through adulthood. Careful, observant, responsible, often self-contained. Traits that look like maturity from the outside, but feel like overextension from the inside. Researchers sometimes call this phenomenon parentification. Others call it accelerated emotional development. But humans living through it know it simply as growing up too fast. Not because life was exciting, but because life was demanding. The body, too, carries this story. People who grew up too soon often describe feeling tired in ways sleep cannot fix. Their exhaustion is neurological, a long-term effect of years spent in states of alertness. Their posture, breathing patterns, and muscle tension all reflect a childhood spent bracing for something they couldn't name at the time. Over the years, this internal state becomes a personality, something people praise, something others rely on, something that looks like stability and wisdom, but inside, It is simply a system that adapted early and never found the opportunity to rest. And so the science aligns with the story. Feeling older than your age is not imagination, and it is not a compliment. It is a physiological echo of childhood experiences that forced the brain and body to grow before the heart was ready. There is a conflict inside people who grew up too soon, a quiet, private battle that no one else can see. On the outside, they appear steady, responsible, composed, the kind of person others turn to when life becomes difficult. But inside, there is a tug of war between the child they were forced to abandon and the adult they were forced to become. This conflict begins with a simple truth. They never learned how to be young. Not truly, not freely. While others stumbled through adolescence, failing, trying again, making mistakes without fear, they were behaving like miniature adults, anticipating consequences, avoiding disruption, doing everything possible to stay in control. Their strength was never a choice. It was protection. As adults, this shows up in strange ways. They often feel responsible for things that have nothing to do with them. If someone is upset, they feel the urge to fix it. If someone is disappointed, they internalize the blame. If someone pulls away, they scan themselves, wondering if they said or did something wrong. This hyper-responsibility is not rational. It is instinctual. A survival habit from childhood when keeping others emotionally stable meant keeping themselves safe. At the same time, there is a deep yearning for softness. A part of them quietly longs to be cared for, to lean on someone without fear, to rest without feeling guilty. But when softness appears, it feels foreign, even frightening, because leaning on someone requires trust, and trust feels like a luxury they never had. This creates an emotional paradox. They want connection, but fear dependence. They crave rest, but fear what might happen if they stop being the strong one. They wish for someone to understand them, but instinctively hide the most vulnerable parts of themselves. It is a push and pull between longing and self-protection, between who they became and who they never got to be. Another layer of this conflict lies in identity. When someone grows up being mature, responsible, and self-sufficient, these traits become their sense of self. These traits become their value in the eyes of others. So the idea of letting go, of being imperfect, of admitting they are tired or overwhelmed, feels like breaking some unspoken rule. It feels like disappointing everyone who has ever admired their strength. And so, even in moments when they want to fall apart, they hold themselves together. They swallow their emotions. They smile when they are hurting. They avoid asking for support because they are afraid of being seen as needy or inconvenient. In their mind, vulnerability equals danger, an equation written into them long before they understood its meaning. This inner conflict also shows up in the smallest moments. When someone offers help, they hesitate, not because they don't want it, but because they don't know how to accept it. When someone expresses love, they feel warmth and fear at the same time. When someone gives them space to rest, their nervous system does not relax. It waits, alert and prepared, as if rest is a risk, not a right. And beneath all of this lies grief, a grief so subtle it rarely finds words. It is the grief of the childhood they didn't live, the mistakes they never made, the protection they never received, the softness they never felt. This grief does not appear dramatically. It shows up in quiet moments, when they see carefree children, when they watch others be vulnerable without fear, when they realize their body has been tense for years. It is a grief for a timeline that was stolen. This is the secret conflict inside, a life lived too early, and a heart still waiting for the permission to be young. There comes a moment, gentle, unexpected, and quietly life-shifting, when a person finally understands the truth of their own story, not the truth they tell others, not the truth they pretend to believe, but the deeper truth that has been living inside them since childhood. This realization rarely arrives loudly. It doesn't come through dramatic breakdowns or sudden awakenings. It comes through subtle experiences that soften the edges of their defenses. A conversation where someone listens without interrupting. A kindness that requires nothing in return. A memory that rises uninvited, bringing with it a clarity they didn't know they needed. Or sometimes, it appears through contrast. Seeing someone their age behave with a lightness they never had, and understanding, for the first time, that their seriousness was never personality, it was survival. The moment of realization is often disorienting. It feels like seeing yourself from the outside, noticing how your voice always stays calm even when you're hurting, how you apologize out of instinct, how you take responsibility for emotions that are not yours, how you brace your body whenever someone raises their tone. These behaviors that once felt natural suddenly reveal their origin, and the person begins to understand that none of these traits came from age or wisdom. They came from fear, adaptation, and the quiet determination to make it through childhood with as little damage as possible. For many, this clarity shows up during conflict, a moment when they respond with measured calm while someone else reacts with raw emotion. And instead of feeling proud of their composure, they feel a strange sense of sadness because they realize they are not calm. They are controlled. They are holding everything inside because letting go doesn't feel safe. This sadness is not weakness. It is recognition. It is the first time they see their restraint as a wound rather than a skill. For others, the realization comes during love. Not romantic love alone, but any kind of love that asks them to be soft. A friend offering support. A partner trying to understand their silence. A moment of genuine care. And they feel an ache they can't explain. A tightness in the chest. A desire to trust mixed with an urge to run. It is then they understand that being cared for feels foreign because they spent their childhood caring for themselves. There is also a moment, often during a simple, ordinary day, when exhaustion catches up with them. A deep, undeniable fatigue that is not about lack of sleep, but about years of emotional self-management. And in that moment, they realize that feeling older than their age has less to do with maturity and everything to do with unprocessed weariness. But the clearest moment of realization comes from memory, a memory they once dismissed, a scene from childhood they never questioned, an interaction they long considered normal. And suddenly, with adult eyes, they understand how wrong it was, how heavy it was, how early they were forced to become someone they were not ready to be. This realization does not create anger first. It creates compassion, not for the adults who failed them, but for the child they once were. The child who tried their best, who learned to stay quiet, who grew up early because they had no other choice. In the silence of this understanding, something softens. The person finally sees themselves not as someone wise beyond their years, but as someone who survived, someone who adjusted, someone who carried the weight of emotional responsibility long before they had the language to describe it. And from this recognition comes the beginning of healing, the quiet permission to reclaim the years they lost, at their own pace, in their own way. Healing for those who grew up too soon does not appear as a sudden transformation. It unfolds slowly, quietly, in moments that almost feel accidental. There is no dramatic release, no grand breakthrough. Instead, healing begins with a softening, a small shift in the way they respond to life, a gentle loosening of the grip they've held on their own emotions for years. It is not a journey toward becoming someone new. It is a return to the person they never got to be. One of the earliest signs of this return is the ability to notice their own needs without immediately dismissing them. For most of their life, their needs felt inconvenient, something to hide or silence because others seemed to need more. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, they begin to recognize hunger, exhaustion, loneliness, longing not as weaknesses, but as human truths. And in this recognition, something shifts inside them, not dramatically, but like the soft crack in ice that signals the beginning of spring. This return to self also emerges in their relationships. They start allowing themselves to take up emotional space in ways that once terrified them. When someone asks how they are, they pause instead of automatically saying, "I'm fine." When they feel hurt, they notice the ache instead of swallowing it. When another person offers comfort, they do not recoil instantly. They may not fully accept it yet, but they no longer run from it. These moments are small, but they are revolutionary for someone who spent their childhood equating vulnerability with danger. Another part of the healing process is the gradual easing of hypervigilance. Their body, once accustomed to staying alert, begins to trust the quiet. Their shoulders sit a little lower. Their breath settles more naturally. Their mind stops scanning for invisible threats every time the room grows silent. This is not because danger is gone. It is because they have started learning that not all silence hides harm, and not all unpredictability leads to pain. Yet healing is not linear. It moves forward, then pauses. It opens, then closes. There are days when softness feels possible, and days when they slip back into old patterns because the familiar can feel safer than the unknown. And this is part of the slow return. The understanding that becoming gentle with oneself requires patience with the parts that still cling to survival. There is also a newfound curiosity in the life they missed. They begin exploring little pieces of themselves that were buried under responsibility and restraint. A hobby they once wanted to try. A joy they never allowed themselves to feel. A form of rest they always believed they had to earn. They start embracing impulses that may seem childish because they never had the chance to experience them as a child. And in those moments, those soft, unguarded moments, the person glimpses a version of themselves untouched by fear. The slow return to self also involves grieving, not to stay in sadness, but to make space for truth. They recognize that the childhood they lived was not the childhood they deserved. They acknowledge the weight they carried, the silence they kept, the maturity they wore like armor, and instead of minimizing it, they finally let themselves name it. This grief is not a step backward. It is the release of a story they held inside for too long. With time, they begin to experience something new, a gentle internal permission. Permission to rest without guilt. Permission to ask without fear. Permission to be imperfect, emotional, messy, human. Not because they have become weaker, but because they have become safe enough to lay down the armor they never should have needed. The return to self does not make them younger. It makes them whole. It allows them to integrate the resilience they earned with the innocence they lost. It creates a space inside them where strength and softness coexist without conflict. This chapter marks the quiet beginning of something long delayed. The slow, tender reunion between who they had to be and who they were meant to become. In the end, the story of those who felt older than their age is not a story of tragedy. It is a story of becoming, slowly, painfully, beautifully. It is the story of a soul that learned to carry too much and is now learning, piece by piece, that it no longer has to. There comes a point, somewhere in adulthood, when they look back at the timeline of their life and see it differently than they once did. Not as scattered memories or isolated struggles, but as a quiet pattern, a map of moments that shaped their heart before they even had the language to describe what they were feeling. They begin to understand that their emotional age was never a flaw, never a mistake. It was an adaptation, a response to an environment that demanded more from them than childhood should ever have to give. And yet, there is something profoundly human in the way they survived. Something tender in the way they kept going, even when no one noticed their effort. Something admirable in the way they became steady in a world that did not offer them steadiness. Their strength was never loud, never attention-seeking. It was the quiet kind, the kind that builds itself in the shadows and grows roots in the dark. But as they look at themselves now, somewhere between who they were and who they are becoming, they feel a shift, a soft, gentle truth rising within them. They are no longer children who need to be older than their age. They are adults who deserve to feel the age they are. They are allowed to rest. They are allowed to breathe. They are allowed to exist without holding the weight of everyone around them. And slowly, they begin to forgive themselves for the years they spent in survival mode, for the emotions they suppressed, for the tears they never cried, for the joy they never trusted, for the child they could not protect. Forgiveness becomes the quiet beginning of something long delayed, the permission to feel without fear, to exist without guarding, to live without bracing for impact. In small, intimate moments, they start noticing life again in ways they once couldn't. The warmth of morning light feels different. The softness of someone's hand no longer startles them. A quiet evening does not feel dangerous. It feels peaceful. They notice laughter, their own, emerging without effort. Not the polite kind they used to perform, but the real kind that rises from a place inside them that once felt unreachable. And maybe the most healing realization of all is that they did not lose their childhood. It lived inside them the entire time, waiting patiently for the moment they became safe enough to return to it. Not to relive it, but to reclaim it. To give themselves now what they needed then: patience, gentleness, presence, softness, care. In this poetic ending, there is no dramatic triumph. There is only truth. A truth that unfolds like a slow sunrise. Some people grow older too soon, but they also have the power to grow softer later, to let their heart catch up to the age their body has finally reached, to live a life not defined by the weight they carried, but by the peace they allow themselves to create. And so the story closes quietly, with a person standing at the edge of their own life, not older than their age anymore, but exactly where they are meant to be. Not defined by trauma, but shaped by resilience. Not hardened by the past, but softened by the understanding that they no longer have to be strong every moment of the day. The script ends the way healing often begins, gently, slowly, with a whisper of truth settling into the heart. They survived. And now, finally, they can live.